Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you joining us today for our webinar on ensuring FAPE for students with disabilities during COVID-19. My name is Megan Olson. I'm the Managing Director of Programs with the National Center for Special Education and Charter Schools. I will moderate for today and turn it over to one of my most favorite people, Brooke Allen, in just a moment to introduce herself. A couple of norms before we get started. In the chat box, feel free to ask questions throughout the session. I will moderate and flag things for Brooke as they come up. So definitely feel free to ask in the chat box. Also feel free to add any introduction to yourself and your role and your organization. And if you've had a chance to preview the tool, any initial reactions or questions, again, I'll be filtering through that and we'll try to address everything in real time during our webinar for today's session. Our mission at the National Center for Special Education and Charter Schools is to ensure that students with disabilities are accessing and fully thriving in charter schools. And we do this through 4 key work streams, one of which is documenting and communicating facts. We also do a lot of work to inform policy, both at the local, state, and federal level. We develop coalitions of various education stakeholders to come together and try to address change and turn ideas into action to change essentially the status quo for what's happening for students with disabilities in schools, and then also do work to build capacity out in the field. And some of that takes the form of research projects or work with various other entities or organizations. So we're extremely excited today to be sharing with you a tool that we partnered with Brooke and her team in developing, and we feel that it's a timely and helpful resource. And we absolutely developed it in the time of COVID, but hope that it extends far beyond this moment, especially because, as Brooke will walk you through, it's very much a design tool as it is sort of a stamp of exactly what things should look like. So with that, again, you'll see me in the chat box, and I'll drop a folder of resources in there right now that has this tool and a few other things. But at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Brooke Allen, who's the Executive Director of the Diverse Learners Cooperative in Tennessee. So Brooke, you're up.
Hi, good morning, good wherever we are. I'm glad to be here and was so thrilled to partner with the National Center on this project. It was a good challenge for our team, and I am already finding its use in the ways that we support schools and school teams. So I hope that you will as well. I am a special education teacher by background, which is important as we look into this tool and where the content came from. But in my practice, experienced a gap in professional learning and resources that many special education teachers and leaders similarly experience. So the Diverse Learners Cooperative seeks to fill that gap. We work directly with teachers, connecting them to learning, resources, and communities they need to feel more equipped and more empowered to serve diverse learners. And we also work with school teams to identify and improve systems that support students with disabilities and multilingual learners. So we're based out of Nashville, but due to COVID have been able to serve nationally, and we're really excited about that. So today we have a couple of missions that we are going to accomplish. One is review the mandate. What does the government tell us that we need to do during this time? And really, how does that protect students with disabilities during this time of COVID teaching, whether that's virtual learning, hybrid, in-person, socially distanced, all of the words that we've grown accustomed to using. What does the mandate actually say that we need to do? Second is to identify key principles in translating in-person IEPs to remote settings. What are some ways that we need to think about that and do that well? Examine a tool that you can use to support your team in these student-centered IEP decisions. And then hopefully you will walk away with the next step toward ensuring FAPE in the virtual setting. So FAPE, of course, is a requirement under IDEA. A free, appropriate public education is a mandate. We must provide educational opportunities that are appropriate per individual student needs. This mandate remains in place during COVID and always. And so we're constantly asking, and this is a common phrase, of course, that comes up in IEP meetings and in IEP discussions, is how are we making sure that we're ensuring FAPE? And it's never been more important than right now, as we don't have direct and physical access to our students through virtual learning. So for students with disability, ensuring this access to high quality services during school building closures is critical for maintaining their progress toward academic, behavioral, social emotional goals. The US DOE put out guidance early in 2020 stating that FAPE must be provided. And within that mandate, schools must provide services that are appropriate to student need, even if delivered in an alternative way. When we consider what this means for services, we simply know that they must be equally effective, is the terminology that's used in the guidance. Schools across the nation are finding new ways to engage and educate their diverse learners in virtual learning environments. And we have to balance flexibility of our teams and methods with individualization, providing all of the services and support that ensure a child is making progress toward their appropriately ambitious goals. But this is the challenge, right? Over the last 10 months, almost a year, I've fielded so many questions, as others have as well. How do we do this? What options are available? How do we know that a service is still appropriate for a student? And then how do we lead our IEP teams towards student-centered decisions when so many new factors are at play, namely that school buildings are closed? We have heard and used the word translate services a lot, but I think it goes beyond that. Translate it seems to imply that there's a one-for-one exchange of minutes. So 60 minutes in the school building means 60 minutes at home. And that's sometimes true, but maybe not always. We need to think about other modes of translation that are more appropriate. So let's talk more about principles of that decision making. So first, I would be remiss not to start with families. Families are now on the front lines of their child's education, a role shift for many for sure. Before we start translating anything, we must connect with families. What's going well? What isn't? What new needs have appeared or increased? Which needs have lessened in frequency or intensity? And what do you need to support your child at home? Families are obviously a wealth of information, and perhaps even more so now. And increased family input on the front end will create more alignment with student needs in the actual document and plan itself. Find a time and a medium for communication that will work best for you and the family. And if interpretation services are needed, arrange those accordingly. But always get input from families no matter what mode of communication you're using. Next, and this is where we're going to expand our definition of translation, is to consider purpose. Beyond translating minutes, we need to translate purpose. What was the purpose of the current IEP service? What goals did it target? In what ways will the need for this service continue to present itself in the home setting? What alternative approaches will meet the same purpose and be equally effective in the virtual environment? The IEP team can consider service type, location, frequency, lots of ways to adjust what we're doing in order to better meet student needs and serve the same purpose as it did in person. The tool we're going to explore, you'll see visually, it's centered on purpose, and that's purposeful. Now, purpose is where all decisions are going to start and where we'll continue to return. And this is certainly an area in which this design principle can outlive the COVID virtual learning translation. We can think beyond an in-person schedule when designing a support plan that is individualized for the student within the virtual environment. The in-person school setting comes with certain parameters, like we have timed content blocks, teacher schedules that we're navigating, transition time, and other elements that are just different in the virtual or remote setting. So use that setting to the advantage of the student. Consider ways that we can use the setting to maximize frequency and timeliness of feedback, collaborate with co-teachers, utilize digital platforms that provide needed learning. Anticipate that there'll be new needs that go beyond the current IEP. New settings bring up a range of responses in our students, and us for that matter. Knowing the student and their present levels, anticipate where needs may go beyond what is currently reflected in the IEP. You may need to account for additional accommodations, supports, or services based on what you find. Give particular emphasis to behavioral, social, emotional, or executive functioning supports the student may need in the home environment. And then knowing the setting, the schedule, the staffing model alongside student needs, we can get creative. That's what we do best as special educators. We've worked with many teachers over the past few months on identifying what feels like a brand new service, a service we wouldn't normally offer in person, and combining synchronous learning with a scaffolded asynchronous assignment, and then one-on-one check-ins with text, like things that we wouldn't normally do. Some of these services don't have a nice name and a drop down in your IEP software that you're using, but work with the family, discuss what the purpose of the service is, and then document that really well. And then check in frequently. You'll need to check in frequently and adjust where it's not working. This is how we need to be making decisions about services to ensure that we're providing FAPE. In these ways, our students with IEPs will be their IEPs will be appropriately ambitious with the right support to ensure that they're seeing success. But you may still be thinking, well, what does this look like? And that's why the tool came about. As you have maybe seen, we've created a range of models that apply these decision-making principles. Within this guide, you'll find 23 personas. They're organized by disability category. There are about 2 for each IDEA recognized category. Half are primary K-6 examples, while the other half explore what FAPE looks like in the secondary setting. I'm going to take you on a bit of a tour of the tool so you'll know where to direct your attention or your team's attention, but I'm not going to go in order completely from left to right, but I'll explain why. Within each persona, you'll find a description of a unique student, their strengths, their past successes, their current needs, and then below the description is a listing of areas in which the student has current IEP goals. You can hear my dishwasher in the background, I apologize. If you are looking for a profile that is similar to a student that you serve, I would start by looking at the IEP goal areas, and the right combination may be similar to a student that you serve. Now, keeping in mind that none of these personas are meant to be a copy and paste model. The examples that we crafted here were really uniquely based on the student profile that we were working from. And so if you see a student that's similar, it may offer you some new ideas. If you are looking at other profiles, it may offer you ideas of where your student might be different from other students. So use them as examples or models rather than a copy paste of service. Okay, so here's the tool. Beyond the profile, the first place I'd direct your focus is to the sample schedule, which is the column right in the middle. This section, the services, including the setting, frequency, and service provider, are listed down the left column. They're color-coded by setting or type of service. For example, if they're in general education, in a special education setting, related service, or consultation. The middle column is what I was referring to before, is the centering on purpose. That column lists specific actions that take place during that service in support of the student's IEP goals. Taking the time to really consider the utility of each service will improve our IEP team's ability to make student-centered decisions for services during virtual learning. This is the part that I most frequently see missing in our current documentation of services. I see in-person services, and then I see virtual services without much consideration of why we're providing those services in the first place. On the right, that said, is the virtual learning schedule. It's the color-coded column on the far right. We've added another column here of whether services are synchronous or asynchronous, words that we have not used prior to this year. So that becomes really important because we can leverage both forms of learning to serve the same purpose of in-person services. You'll notice that the minutes are sometimes the same, and sometimes they're more, and sometimes they're less. Like I said, we're going to get beyond the translation of minute to minute and really think purpose to purpose. These are all team decisions. There are lots of ways to flex the different factors here: the mode, the frequency, the provider, to better meet the students' needs as they present in the course of virtual learning. These decisions do not happen in a vacuum. For this project, of course, our team discussed them, but that was not an IEP team. When you are making decisions, especially when we're making any changes from in-person to virtual, which we really should be, you're doing those in the context of an IEP meeting. The box to the left of the schedule on the bottom, there's labeled additional supports, and that's on each profile. These may be represented as program supports, modifications, accommodations in the IEP, but many of these for secondary students have a note in here about transition support, which would also be in the IEP. Others note additional documentation that needs to be drafted or updated, like an updated behavior intervention plan or something similar to that. And others have supports that may have already been in the IEP or are new needs that are going to present in the virtual setting due to the child's challenges related to their disability. Actually, let's go back for a second. So on the top box that's labeled key questions, we're going to talk about that box now. While our team developed the sample schedule based on purpose first, the key questions may be a good starting point for you and your IEP teams, and will certainly help you build a more robust and inclusive plan. The questions are mapped by shared characteristics of the student's disability and their age. For example, when considering the IEP of a student with autism at the secondary level, we may ask, how will the use of video conferencing engage or distract the student? Would pre-recorded videos be preferred or beneficial to the student? While a different question for a student with a visual impairment, we may need to ask, how can we ensure equipment and materials like a screen reader or a Braille writer are sent home to allow access to curriculum and instruction? These questions will challenge the IEP team to layer in appropriate supports or services that take into account the remote setting. All the profiles have 3 or 4 questions that are focused on these elements that are specific to disability and age. You'll notice some patterns from persona to persona, including a focus on access to core content, support for social emotional learning, time for team collaboration, and opportunities for peer interaction. And on this slide, you'll see some of the elements we drew from. So these are the categories. I would suggest for your teams to identify the key questions for your student by disability category and age. Your team can choose to answer these in an IEP meeting or within another team collaboration or as preparation for the meeting. And there might be others that you want to include as well. So Megan just dropped a link to another like a supplementary resource that catalogs all of the key questions across the personas that we have here. Make sure to share the questions with the IEP team, including the family, ahead of time if you're going to discuss them, to add depth to the discussion that you've had time to think about it and prepare, and then to any decisions that are made would be more appropriate. So we also made a blank template for you. No, it was a text that I got from a parent last week, and they said, I love your tool. This is so helpful. And I want to make one for my own child. And so I already started, but do you have an actual blank one? And we do, and it is linked here, but I just loved the initiative that this parent was taking to be prepared for their son's IEP meeting, but also the value that they saw in listing out the purposes and considering the student's strengths first and thinking about supports that may be in addition to what we're already offering. Now, this one is a more visual copy of the profile, but Megan also dropped the link to a student planning template that is more editable for your team it has all the same categories, but in a Google Doc form. And so feel welcome to use that in your team discussions. So those are both linked here as well. So how could you use this tool in your own work and practice? One, share with teachers, specialists, school leaders, and families. We have found when in all of these audiences, a lot of utility and just seeing examples of how this could work, and then thinking about their own child or their own students and how they could support their teams in making similar kinds of decisions. Use the personas as a model for yourself or your team. Like I said, it's not a copy paste situation. It is really a learning and understanding and recentering our practices on why we offer these services and what purpose they serve for our students. Use the key questions to guide an IEP team discussion. You can use the blank template as a starting place for a brainstorm. It doesn't replace the IEP, of course, but it's a great place to start recording these ideas so that you can make a really great IEP that serves the students. And then advocate that ensuring FAPE is possible. We've proved that through these 23 examples of students with a really wide variety of needs, that we can provide FAPE in the virtual setting, and we have to get creative to do so. So the excuses become less when we see really good examples, and it's a great way to support your team in saying, let's dig in and learn about a new way to do this. So with that, we had some great questions last week and some great conversation about what certain profiles looked like and how teams were going to use this in their own settings. So we would love to hear from you. We can look at a specific persona together, or if you have other ideas, questions, or reflections about the tool, you might share what you find most helpful about the tool. What about the tool challenges your current practices, or how you plan to use the tool in your own setting? And with that, we can open it up for conversation.
Thanks, Brooke. And I'm going to paste these questions into the chat box so that they're there. And I was wondering if we could navigate to Nichelle, who I think is a late elementary school student. And Nichelle is a good example of a student that has a BIP and a behavior intervention plan, and how that transferred over into developing in the virtual environment. And I also just wanted to flag for folks that are live now and potentially watching this webinar later on, that there is a small error that we are in the process of fixing. I just want to call it out so that if you have the old version, you'll see. So this student example is serving two purposes. If you can walk us through that, Brooke.
Great. Yes, I can. Let me rearrange my screen here so I can see it as well. Okay. Awesome. So this is Michelle. Michelle is a 5th grade student with bipolar disorder, which falls under in this case, falls under the category of emotional disturbance under IDEA. And she has a behavior intervention plan. And it says that she gets along well with peers, but she has been written up for fighting in the bathroom and lunchroom numerous times. So we know that there is something about maybe unstructured time or transitions that are challenging for Nichelle. So when we launched into her IEP, what it said prior to COVID, our in-person IEP, was that she had 90 minutes 5 times a week during her unstructured activities of a one-on-one paraprofessional. And the purpose of that paraprofessional was to promote safety during classroom transitions, lunch, recess, and school events, and for the student to self-assess progress toward daily goals. So they would work on that together. Now, when we think about this in the virtual setting, of course, transitions, lunch, recess, school events, those are all different. And so having a one-on-one paraprofessional for 90 minutes a day actually just wasn't going to meet the same purposes that Nichelle had in order to meet her goals. So instead, and this is where the mistake is, it should say a paraprofessional PM checkout, 10 minutes, 1 time a day instead of a week. And so we're getting that fixed. But every day the paraprofessional is checking in with the student about, how are things going at home, self-assessing progress toward daily goals. So it still meets that purpose, but the other activity is just less than necessary in this home setting. Now, if that wasn't working, this is where having really great communication with the family becomes really important, right? Like what other, if she was struggling with lunchroom behaviors in school, is she struggling with something different at home? And so we may need to alter the paraprofessional minutes through an IEP team meeting again, or work with the family in providing them additional supports that they can implement at home as well, depending on the situation. She also has behavior consultation for 2 times a month in person, and that was the special education teacher with the general education team. In the virtual setting, this is the same, but it adds a behavior consultation with the family. Because the family is serving such a unique role in virtual learning, this becomes really important to include them in. Now, this may not be a service. Like I said, we don't normally write a family into an IEP, and I would even hesitate to do that here, but it may be an accommodation or a program modification that we make clear that we're working directly with the family to provide certain supports at home. She also had a social skills intervention that was 30 minutes 1 time per day that carries over virtually, because the purpose of that was to provide direct instruction and opportunities to practice. So that small group can still happen in a virtual setting for this 5th grader. And then finally, she had one-on-one counseling, 30 minutes 1 time per week. That also continues, same provider, same frequency, and gives the student the ability to develop strategies for managing anxiety and coping with non-preferred situations. And to point out over here on the additional supports, revising her BIP, her behavior intervention plan, to reflect the virtual setting is absolutely necessary. And the part here that we don't want to forget is that we need to then train staff on what that BIP looks like, and model, how to implement it and the ways in which we are going to prompt or provide additional support. Providing access to behavior de-escalation breaks, still really important for the student in virtual environment. As we got to know her needs, this became evident that it needed to stay in the IEP. Focus on building independence with support from the paraprofessional during specific times of the day. So if there were certain periods that felt more challenging, we might leverage the access to the paraprofessional. And then fade supports over time, especially as the student is preparing for middle school. Does that help?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Brooke. And we have another question about suggestions related to the constant change in environment. And so many schools are virtual, and then they're in person, and then they're virtual again, synchronous and then asynchronous. And if there's any suggestions about how to navigate that. And one thing I'll say before I turn it over to you is, developing this tool was an absolute exercise in and of itself. I mean, these are now like Brooke's students, like they feel like her class. But one thing that really jumped out at us is the process itself. So this is not, this looks beautiful as a resource, but the final product isn't what's valuable here. It's how the decisions are made. What are the questions that are asked? What are the things that are considered as the environment changes, potentially even back and forth, as we know, is actually not a potential, but a reality. And one of the things that has jumped out at us is just, we really hope that in this sort of design process and decision-making process that we've all been going through this school year, that it actually makes us reevaluate the quote unquote old processes that we used to go through in developing students' support needs or services or IEPs or whatever it was. So there's a real potential to improve upon the types of services we develop for students regardless of the environment. We hope that this helps trigger that intentionality and probably change in a little bit of the process. But if you could walk us through any ideas that you may have, or if other schools have ideas, feel free to add it in the chat box, or even feel free to unmute yourselves. There's a lot of knowledge in this space and people can definitely share out beyond the tool, but how to navigate the change in environment back and forth.
Yeah, so I've seen this approached a couple of different ways. One is like how we make the actual changes to the IEP. Are they done on the IEP and it's reflected as virtual learning? And then we have to change completely if we come back in person, or are you creating a contingency plan or additional document that says, this is what we do virtually, this is what we do in person. They may not match, but they do match on purpose, and they will serve the students in helping them see success to the goals. So if it's not obvious, feel like that's a better option than switching the IEP back and forth. And this is provided for in the guidance. So the guidance says that you can have some version of a contingency plan. I've seen those conversations be a lot more effective, not only in the moment, but then when they do switch back and forth a school, whether it's a quarantine situation and the whole class needs to quarantine, or it's hybrid learning, or they're actually like trying to phase back in to come in person, is having that conversation up front allows them to make those decisions much more agilely. And it's like almost like tip of tongue to say, well, this is what we already talked about. And so this is how we do it in the virtual setting as well, or whatever setting you're going to. Hopefully these changes kind of peter out over the course of the next few months, but I would expect that having the conversations up front become a lot more visible and ready when we're ready to implement those. That's one thought. But if there are others, I'd love to hear.
Nothing else in the chat box right now, but I did resurface the questions that you had on the screen. We are really curious about what folks have found most helpful about the tool, and if there are things about the tool that challenge current practices. So feel free to share again in the chat, or even we have a great sized group. So if you want to unmute yourself and share anything or ask a question, now is your time. And in the meantime, Brooke, if there are any other students that you wanted to give a voice over to a certain component of their persona or service schedule.
I was just thinking about that. So
yeah.
Like we said, I do feel like some of these are my students now. But a couple of notes about where services were increased or where services were lessened. So this student is Marcus, and he is a student on the autism spectrum. And in person, he had a 10-minute check-in with a teacher or a special educator, I assume, here 5 times per week. So that was happening twice daily. That check-in was reduced because it was going to be done by text message in the morning and the afternoon. But what we did add was a midday check-in with the family, which could happen again via text message, like how are things going, or specific questions that you might ask. So that was a place where the minutes increased in a way. There's also another profile for a student with a visual impairment. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Where the services were not able to be provided at home, or it didn't make sense. Is it this one? It's the next one. There we go. Because they were related to navigating, using like an orientation and mobility specialist to navigate school and school settings. And so, here we go. Here it is. The goal was around building skill and practice navigating school settings. And that was happening 1 time per day because that was a really important skill for Sage here, who I have a personal connection with because that's my daughter's name. Build skill for navigating settings. But this service was not going to be provided virtually. because it was not something that you can actually physically do. But a note here was that the IEP team will consider the need for compensatory services when we return to the school building. So she may need additional services when we return, and that's something that we want to consider, and would be really affirming to an IEP team and the family to say, this isn't, we're not providing it because we can't. We're going to provide it even in full when we return, to make sure that she does not regress on those skills and that she has plenty of opportunities to practice with those skills. So that would be I would think really affirming to a family to say that it's not off the table. It's just that we need to have this conversation in a different way. So, some notes there.
And I believe that's the only persona where there's a mention of compensatory services, or maybe there's one other, which I just highlight in that, again, the ability to demonstrate what is possible in terms of designing optimal learning for students with a range of needs, and that not everything is just, this can't be done, we can't figure it out, and so compensatory services will just be waiting for the student. That hopefully in most situations with most of your students, services can be provided, and this tool demonstrates a way to be more dynamic with service delivery or service provision. And the other thing that you mentioned before that I wanted to bring up were just the opportunity that I think we've all seen, but this tool also continues to demonstrate, is the ways in which we actually have moved to a phase of co-creating expectations or learning environments with families. And we, really hope that that doesn't take a downshift when things return in person. I mean, there are so many things that we've learned as schools and as educators, and we're doing things way more than we used to, whether it's universal design for learning or leveraging technology, that we shouldn't be going back to whatever we were doing before. We should be integrating what we've learned over this last year and actually changing what learning looks like, what teaching looks like. So there's the piece about the families, and then another educator in our previous webinar brought up this question of how to involve students in this process. And so curious to hear if there are schools that have really authentically engaged students in helping to make decisions, or just taking into consideration how to design what learning could look like for them at this point in the virtual environment. So if schools want to share, and if not, again, considering students and families is a critical component to this process.
I have one more quick example too that I
Great, go for it.
A different idea to show here is that this is Demetrius, and he was receiving co-taught English 5 times a week previously, and then literacy intervention 2 times a week for 45 minutes. The co-taught English served the purposes of accessing small group, or the special education supports that were provided. We're accessing small group breakouts, free teaching, an additional review, and then extended time as needed. As well as accommodated assignments to include highlighted course text, structured notes, writing frames, those kinds of supports. Those kinds of supports would be continued to be provided in the co-taught setting virtually. But what we added here was what would normally happen in a literacy intervention, this background knowledge building with course text, like we would preview the text or things like that, could actually be done via an asynchronous online platform. So we could either create a video that previews the text that all students have access to, or specific to a group of students within that co-taught English class. It wouldn't necessarily need to be the synchronous literacy intervention that serves that same purpose, which is why the lines are done like they are here. There's several of these examples where we can take what normally is done in a co-taught classroom and be more effective in a small group setting, or the opposite, what would normally be done in a small group literacy setting. And we can leverage a particular structure that we have for virtual learning, like an asynchronous platform, to serve the same purpose. So when you see examples where it looks crossed up like that, it's to really get at that the purpose is the same, but the ways in which we can deliver on that purpose are different.
It's a really good example to walk through.
Any other questions or examples that are needed? Or how you're planning to use this tool as an example or model or process with your team?
Yeah, I was going to ask the exact same question, Brooke. We're really curious to hear how schools might use this tool with teams.
It's a quiet group. We have the inauguration going on in the background, I'm sure.
Well, we can give folks another minute or two to, if they were going to jot something in the chat box, and then if not, perhaps we navigate over to our final slide just to provide you all with our contact information. I would say for specific questions about the tool, Brooke is your go-to person. In terms of resources, we will share this recorded webinar, the presentation slides, and the resource folder that includes the tool and some of the supplementary resources that we created to actually help with the design and decision making. Again, we can't emphasize enough that while the tool itself is beautiful and a great resource, the substance of it and the value of it is in how it's used to make decisions for your students to optimize their learning regardless of the environment, and to demonstrate all that is possible when it comes to educating diverse learners. And I don't see any other questions. So reach out if you do have questions. Stay tuned for the resources and materials. Thank you so much, Brooke. It's been great to partner with you and your team. And with that, we will let you all head out a little bit early, and some good suggestions on the resource that we will factor in there. Some schools are going to share this in meetings. Absolutely. Wonderful. Okay, so with that, we will give you all back some time and share these resources out to you before the end of the week, hopefully. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.